Our first question on this to Elizabeth May. Ms. May, you've called the government we have now an elected dictatorship, and you've called for electoral reform. But this election will be won and lost under the current electoral system. Do you worry that Green candidates will take support away from other parties that could defeat this government? Might the Green Party help re-elect this government?
When I refer to the government as an elected dictatorship, it's not personal in any way to the Prime Minister nor to his party. It's a reference to what's happened, a creeping growth, an unhealthy growth of power in the Prime Minister's office, which goes along with less of a role for individual members of Parliament in doing their fundamental job. The only job description for a member of Parliament is that found in the Constitution, which is to represent your constituencies. So we need to actually revisit parliamentary democracy, understand that this election isn't about electing a prime minister. We don't do that in this country. We elect members of Parliament, and their job is to find the government that will hold the confidence of the House so we can work for Canadians. As far as Greens being concerned about this, not at all. Where we have had success, and we've now had my election in Saanich Gulf Islands, but across provinces. In British Columbia, Andrew Weaver. In New Brunswick, David Coon. In Prince Edward Island, Peter Bevan Baker. All of us got elected by driving up voter turnout. So instead of fixating on this splitting the vote non-problem, vote splitting, we need to focus on the real problem, which is that 40% of Canadians in the last number of elections haven't voted. And vote abandoning, in my view, is a much bigger problem than vote splitting. And we're going to do everything we can to reach out to young people, First Nations, and those disadvantaged by the Conservative Fair Elections Act to get out a higher level of vote so that Greens can win in the current system, but that so Canada wins with a healthier democracy.
You've said we don't elect a prime minister, and that's true. But we saw quite a mess of a coalition crisis in 2008. Are we headed towards that sort of arbitrage among parties after the next election if there's no majority?
I can't tell you how committed Green MPs as a caucus will be to working with other parties, working across party lines to ensure that we go from a precarious, perhaps two-year minority parliament to a stable, productive, effective parliament. Because you look at really great parliaments in this country, and I refer viewers back to Lester B. Pearson, where the small group of NDPers under David Lewis and Diefenbaker and the Conservatives and Lester B. Pearson delivered our social safety net.
No prime minister should make it easier. No prime minister should make it easier for Quebec to separate from Canada, Mr. Mulcair.
I was just going to say, isn't it ironic that this segment was supposed to be our democratic institutions, starting with clips about how much heckling there is in the House of Commons, how difficult it is to have a civil conversation. We can, as Canadians, it's been our hallmark for generations that we can disagree without being disagreeable, and I would like us to be able to talk about what we do about fixing Parliament, because that's an urgent crisis, and I don't believe that we want to get ourselves mired into any threat of separatism. Well, with all due respect, Mr. Prime Minister, whoever gave you the advice that simply announcing you wouldn't appoint senators is constitutional needs to go back to law school. What you're doing is unconstitutional. But the single biggest scandal that has yet occurred in the Canadian Senate was not the misspending. It was the really illegitimate notion that the Prime Minister's office has the right to tell its Conservative senators how to vote. And for the first time in the history of this country, a bill passed in the House of Commons, a democratically elected House, passed Bruce Heyer's Climate Accountability Act, and when it went to the Senate, the Conservative senators were instructed to kill it at their first opportunity. This is the first time in the history of this country that appointed senators have killed a bill without a single day of study in the Senate of Canada.
Mr. Harper, did you ask the senators to stop that bill?
We always ask senators to do, we cannot force them to do anything. What we ask them to do, Paul, is we ask them to support the party's position.
I'm being reminded that Elizabeth May has not had much of a chance to address these questions.
I would appreciate that. The way that the Greens advocate that we change the way we make decisions in Canada to create a space where we can work together is to create a Council of Canadian Governments, which would include building on the Council of Federation, but federal, provincial, territorial, representation from municipal and local governments, as well as First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, around the same table. We need to deal with the Senate. It's not my top priority because it's hard. It's going to require opening up the Constitution. We think we should amend the amending formula so that Canadians can change our Constitution by referendum instead of the antiquated formula we're saddled with today.
Elizabeth May brought herself into this debate by knowing her numbers, by knowing her facts, and by knowing what she was going to say ahead of time, by having a very clear, concise message. She got there. She made her point. I don't know if it's going to connect with Canadians, but at least she got into that debate.
John Geddes.
I agree with the point on Elizabeth May. I think she's looked strong.
We've been talking about the polls that have been going on live all night. The latest one about first past the post, Trudeau in favor of that. Look at the number.
Yeah, this is a clear preference, right? 83% of Canadians watching today polling think that we should change the system.